and welcome to the latest in the IoT Security Foundation series of monthly webinars. Since you last saw us, we had an in-person event in England at the start of June. It took place at Coventry's MTC. Thank you very much to all who attended and all of the brilliant speakers that we had on the day. We also had a fantastic event even the month before in Bangalore as well. Over 120 people showed up for that one. So thanks to everybody who attended there. We now look to the 2025 IoTSF Annual Conference, which will be a joint event alongside TechWorks AI. It will happen in London at the IET on Thursday, the 30th of October. The call for speakers is open now, and it's got a deadline of Friday, the 11th of July. Sponsorship and exhibitor opportunities are also available right now, and if you take out a package before the 31st of July, you'll get it at last year's prices. Several of the packages, by the way, include a guaranteed speaker slot as well. For any and all details about the annual conference this October, go to iotsf-ai.org, and if you're watching this live, I'll put a link in Zoom chat in just a few moments. Coming up shortly, we'll have decentralized space systems, frameworks for the future of space communities. That's with Beth Probert and Agatha Buis of Glasgow's Strathclyde University. But first, we have a gentleman in Seattle who is known as the godfather of threat modeling. He is none other than Adam Shostack. His presentation today is entitled A Seat at the Table. Important technical decisions are often made by a small team, and that team rarely includes security. There are good reasons for that, but it does lead to predictable problems. Why doesn't security get a seat at the table? What problems result? What can we do to overcome both? Now, today's format is a bit different to how we normally do it. Adam is time limited, so he'll be taking questions about his presentation straight after he's finished. So if you have any questions, comments, or observations for Adam, get them in quickly. Please use Zoom chat. Adam is the author of a book called Threats. Every engineer should learn from Star Wars. So he's got a few references to do with Star Wars in his presentation today. We now cross over to Washington. Adam, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you. Let me just pull up my slides, and in the interest of time, I am just going to jump in and talk about this seat at the table, what it means and how we get it. And when I think about a seat at the table, I think about two different tables. At one table, and you can guess which one this is, people are leaning forward, they're engaged, they're talking to one another, and they're getting work done. And at the other, they're scowling at each other, they're sniping, and they're reviewing, they're approving something that's been done. And it's crucial as we think about how we bring security to the engineering processes that our company uses to deliver value, that we think about this table or these tables. And at a table, there's dialogue before there's discussion. And when I say dialogue, what I mean is that we're exploring ideas in a fluid way. We might be prototyping, we might be exploring, asking questions like, what if, or how about? And as that dialogue proceeds, we eventually see a switch to a discussion mode where we're making decisions about the things that we might actually go ahead and deliver. We're going to commit to ideas. And it's at this time where there is fluidity that we have the most opportunity to introduce security rather than bolting it on later. And, a lot of times when I talk, especially when I'm talking in Silicon Valley, people treat design as a dirty word, but it's happening anyway. It's an ongoing and engaged process. And if you work at a company where you use something like RACI, responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, as a model of who's involved in what conversation, design happens when people are at the responsible end of that, not the consulted or the informed end of that. And I know, by the way, I know when I'm talking to the IoT Security Foundation that many of you, but not all of you based on my experience, many of you have design processes that happen officially, but still, they are processes that tend to happen around a small table. And this metaphor of the table is not unique to security. The reason it's not unique to security is because when decisions are being made, seating is limited because there is a trade-off between the number of people around the table and how quickly things are getting done. And so seating is limited. There's competition for a seat. And somewhat frustratingly for me as a security person, security doesn't tend to play at this table. We tend to say things like, that would be insecure. Okay, that's not particularly helpful. Or, we'll run a vuln scan when it's done. Okay, we'll come back to you when it's done. Excuse me. And so often when we are thinking about security at a table, it looks a little bit more like this than either of the other two. And it's not necessarily a collaborative scene. Another version of this, I love this old tweet from Simon Bennett's, who commented that, and Simon, by the way, writes a security proxy called ZA Proxy, and someone on some security group decided they were going to email him a PDF with 2,000 critical violations listed. And this is incredibly frustrating and not helpful, but it represents how security teams sometimes act and the very vehemently negative responses that our behavior can drive. And so when I think about a seat at the table, I don't want you to think about a seat at the table because of things like CRA Appendix 3. That is not going to win you a seat at the table, even though CRA is coming, and CRA is going to require some changes in your security process. If you show up arguing for a seat at the table because of CRA, you're unlikely to succeed, because the response will be, we'll have somebody write up a thing after we've done the real work. Instead, I think we win a seat at the table when we focus on things like quality management, we focus on things like safe and effective products. Those tie to the business values that matter. And so, what do we need to do that? And I'm going to talk about tools and consistency today. I think I'm not going to have time to talk about a crawl, walk, run approach, but I just wanted to mention up front that this is not winning a seat at the table is not flipping a switch. It's developing new muscles, it's developing new skill sets and new culture, and that always takes some time. And I do this because I believe that threat modeling is the best way to drive security through your product, through your service, through your thing in the Internet of Things. And we skipped over a lot of my bio, but I have been developing and shipping software and systems for going on 30 years now. I've been threat modeling for 25 of those, and I really find it is the most effective and important work that I do. So what is it? Well, let's start with a simple definition. Threat modeling is using models to help us think about security. And when I say a model, I mean an abstraction. We're going to get rid of some details so we can see the forest rather than focusing on the trees. And I'm using threats to mean possible future problems. The bully threatened to beat me up if I didn't give him my lunch money, or it's threatening to rain. In each of these, we're thinking about a problem that might happen and what we might do about it. And we can use these techniques of threat modeling on either or both systems that we're producing and systems that we're deploying. So we can threat model our cloud infrastructure. We can threat model our IT infrastructure. And there's two aphorisms that I like to use. The first is measure twice, cut once. And when we're thinking about, say, a wood shop, we know that we want to measure twice and cut once because otherwise we end up with a pile of scrap wood in the corner. And that scrap is less visible when we're doing software work, but the waste comes in work that needs to be redone. It comes in late-breaking arguments about whether or not a risk is acceptable. And we can avoid it with a little bit of forethought and care. We'll talk about how in just a second. The other thing that I like to say is a quote from architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who said, "You can fix it on the drawing board with an eraser or on the job site with a sledgehammer." And the same thing applies to code. And especially it applies to IoT. Once it's burned into silicon or built in the factory or sitting on a boat, it takes a lot more work to fix it and it's a lot messier. So how do we do this? We use a 4-question framework, which I created. Those 4 questions are: what are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good job? And a set of experts in threat modeling, along with myself, created a threat modeling manifesto. You can see it there. And the details, the reasoning behind the questions are available in a free white paper. It's available on our website. And these very, very simple questions enable some scenario-specific ways of answering the question, but much more importantly, they enable you to align threat modeling to how you deliver value. Each of you works for a company that is successful at delivering something. If I came in and I said, here's my 50-page security process, which I think you should adopt, it tends to bounce off your engineering organization. And because it's bouncing off, it doesn't do any good. These 4 simple questions are questions that I really believe everyone should be able to answer. And that makes it easier to align them to your engineering process. And in doing so, it creates a common language where we can have this conversation about what can go wrong and what we're going to do about it up and down the leadership chain and across engineering. The other thing that is important about threat modeling, and sometimes the 4 questions don't emphasize this enough, so I'm emphasizing it here, is that threat modeling gives us an opportunity to identify and enhance boundaries. Boundaries give us isolation, they give us the non-interference property, and finding places to put those boundaries and finding places to enforce those boundaries is something that you get from threat modeling work. And so as we think about the questions, we get into different ways of answering them, each appropriate to your engineering process. That might be whiteboard diagrams or Lego models. It might be data flow diagrams or state machines. When we get to the question of what can go wrong, we might brainstorm and talk about it and bring up what's on people's minds. And let me just say how utterly important it is to give people a chance to bring up what's on their minds, the things that they're concerned about, and also to augment that with structured methods like use of stride or miter's attack or embed to help you get consistency in your answers. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. So when we think about the question of what are we working on, we can use a relatively simple data flow diagram, and you've got a trust boundary here that is surrounding an IoT camera. And one way we might set this up would be we have an app connects with Wi-Fi to some camera app that's on the camera. And then there's a browser version of it which connects to a cloud-driven user interface which also connects. Another way we could choose to design this involves some of those boundaries, some isolation, where instead of having a single app running on the camera kernel, we've got a user interface and one user ID, we've got some business logic, we've got an updater, and we've also built some isolation in the cloud. And if you're a security person, you will very quickly think about these as having different security properties that are visible because a picture is worth 1,000 words. And then we can go to the question of what can go wrong. We can get into things like spoofing by an end user. How does the cloud know who the user in the browser is? What cameras does that user have access to? If there's a single database, does that database control access properly? These questions of what can go wrong can come out of a structured analysis like stride, or it can come out of a security person's experience. But when it comes out of something like stride, we do a better job of winning a seat at the table because it brings us consistency. If we're brainstorming, we ask 3 experts. We've got 3 experts who are going to be speaking with you on this call today. Maybe we each have different opinions about the question of what can go wrong. And if we've got different experience, we've got different skills, our next speakers have more experience with space systems than I do, they're going to come up with a different set of threats to a satellite than I might. And that creates a problem. When we ask 3 experts, we get 4 different answers, and people are like, I don't know who to invite to the next meeting. And when we get to the mechanisms that give us consistency, we increase the likelihood that we will be engaged in a way that works at scale and speed and wins us that seat at the table and keeps that seat at the table. That consistency really drives collaboration that's effective. Threat modeling is a big tent. When I think about developing software by analogy, there are lots of tasks. I might design something, I might write some code, I might debug that code, I might run some unit tests, I might commit it to a version control system. And with each of these tasks, I might use a different tool. My deliverables are different. Threat modeling is also a big tent. The tasks, the tools, the deliverables are going to align to a specific process, to your specific process, not mine. And that's one of the values that we get from the 4 questions. They allow us to use building blocks to create the threat modeling process that the people we're helping and supporting need, rather than having a single monolithic process that may or may not align. And this allows us to engage rather than review. We can influence early when we're in dialogue rather than coming in at the end and saying, that would be insecure. And I think a lot of the standards which you work under are in fact incorporate a requirement for threat modeling of various types. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some of the soft skills that we need. I see that we have some questions here. I'm going to spend just a minute on crawl, walk, run, and then take those. So first, threat modeling can be intimidating. There's jargon, there's a lot of skills you may need. There's high impact if you get it wrong. And I see a question from Brian here, worrying that missing threats because of rigidity of thoughts might lead us to get it wrong. We'll talk about that in a second, but that form of concern can lead people to say, let's leave it to the experts. And that means that it's delayed. Those experts have to be educated about the specific systems that you're developing. That takes time, and that creates a review process rather than an engagement process. When you crawl, I want to encourage you to ask the 4 questions. Just ask them, see what comes out, and start to develop confidence in your ability to ask them. As you walk, tools like Elevation of Privilege, which is a card game that I created to help people threat model, can help you get to a little more consistency, can help draw people in. You can learn all about it. It's Creative Commons licensed at showstack.org/EOP. And as you run, you might get to a stage like threat model every story. You might expect that every developer in your organization might be familiar with techniques like Stride. You might get nuanced about who needs to run, how often they need to run as part of responsibilities that exist in your company. And so with that, I want to close out by saying that threat modeling doesn't need to be complicated to be the best way to drive security through your product or your service. So to win a seat at the table, you need the tools, you need the consistency, and you need to set your own expectations and those of the people around you that you're going to crawl, then walk, then run as you deliver more secure products and services. So with that, I want to say thank you. Appreciate your attention. I think we've got some questions that, Chris, are you going to relay those to me?
I will indeed, Adam. Thank you very much. Just a couple of things to mention, Adam, before we get into the Q&A. First of all, I want to publicly thank Ian Pearson, who is our mutual friend at Microchip, who introduced us and managed to facilitate your part in the webinar today. So thank you very much indeed, Ian. Next month's IoT Security Foundation webinar takes place on the day before the European Union's Radio Equipment Directive becomes mandatory. So on Thursday, the 31st of July, which we're calling Red Eve, we'll have a special Red webinar. It will feature Richard Marshall of Zytex presenting, and then in a break from our traditional webinar format, we'll have a roundtable Red discussion with the IoTSF's Regulatory Watch Working Group. We'll also have BSI involved. You can register now. I'll be putting the link in Zoom chat in just a few moments if you're watching live. That's a 60-minute Red special on Red Eve, Thursday, 31st of July, 2025. That's going to be a big one. Right, to the Q&A for Adam. Here we go. This